Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Glad you're here with us. My name is Anthony Mills. I am the Executive Director of GNI, Global Innovation Institute. As most of you know, GNI is the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership organization in the field of applied business innovation. We have a professional certification program and a business accreditation program. And we have individuals who are certified literally all over the world, businesses that are accredited for their innovation programs and innovation assets all over the world. And we are very blessed to have many authorized providers that we work with all around the world as well, and continue to grow that community. One of the things that we do to really help promote the knowledge for innovation is to host a monthly webinar series, and that's what brings us here today. Today is our July 2024 webinar, and so I want to welcome all of you here for joining us. What I'd like to do now is introduce our guest speaker today who's here with us and tell you a little bit about him and share with you what he's going to be sharing with us and talking about. So our guest today is Mr. Carlo Mahfouz. Carlo is an award-winning author, advisor, and corporate innovator. He's the visionary behind the best-selling book, Reality Check, In Pursuit of the Right Questions, a transformative work that explores the power of asking the right questions to drive innovation and navigate the complexities of modern business. His book has received high praise for its thought-provoking insights and practical advice. With a career spanning over 15 years, Carlo has driven change and innovation across diverse sectors, including healthcare, educational technology, and nonprofit organizations. His engineering background, coupled with his early work in game design and computer graphics animation, combines technical proficiency with artistic vision, highlighting his ability to bridge human ingenuity with technological advancement. Currently, as the Vice President of Strategic Technology Partnerships at Laerdare Medical, Carlo focuses on leveraging cutting-edge technologies to improve patient outcomes and healthcare education. His work exemplifies his commitment to fostering innovation through strategic collaboration and advanced technological solutions. A passionate classical music enthusiast and novice opera singer, Carlo heads innovation at Lyrica Classic, a nonprofit organization that promotes less well-known and contemporary music performances. This unique blend of artistic and technological pursuits enriches his perspective and fuels his innovative thinking. In addition to his book, Carlo reaches readers each week through his newsletter, The Presence Pulse. In this newsletter, Carlo shares his journey to achieving deep focus and clarity, drawing from his experiences in both the analytical, technology-driven world and the creative, artistic realm. The newsletter is thus a raw, unfiltered exploration of the human experience, designed to help readers recognize, understand, and cultivate their own deep presence. Carlos's upcoming book, The Culture of Why and the Rise of AI, delves into the philosophical and existential implications of AI's rise. It explores AI's impact on human identity, agency, and the culture of why that drives our narratives and shapes our understanding of the world. The book examines the disruption that AI will bring to the cultural bedrock informed by why and how those changes will be hastened. Carlo grew up in Lebanon and graduated with a bachelor's degree from Notre Dame University. He also holds an executive MBA from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. His philosophy centers on the power of asking the right questions to spark and sustain innovation, with a hope for a future where continuous learning and adaptability drive meaningful progress and global change. Today, Carlo is going to be talking to us about the fact that innovation is about asking the right questions. And indeed, in a world where we're bombarded by information and technological advancements, what does it take to remain innovative? And how can we see things differently? What Carlo proposes is that we need to have more reality check moments. These involve a set of principles that help us remove all the filters that keep us away from the questions that matter most, and ultimately the reality of their answers. As innovators, this is very important to us because it's only when we get past those filters and down to the actual reality of things, especially those things with people and markets, that we'll be able to conceive truly meaningful and impactful innovations that move the needle for those markets. And one other last thing before I turn it over to Carlo, in our chat, I'd like for you to let us know where you're joining us from, as well as, if you're willing, tell us about one big frustration or challenge that you're facing that you're willing to share about, and we might pick that to talk about in this process. So, with all that, join me now, if you will, in welcoming Mr. Carlo Mahfouz. Carlo, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm super happy to be here and looking forward to sharing and working with you all, hopefully. So please send some of the challenges because we might have a surprise if you're willing to engage. Let me share my screen and let's get going. Okay. Innovation is about asking the right questions. Fellow innovators, I know you are bored out of your mind, frankly, talking about Kodak, Nokia, Blockbuster, the missed opportunities of innovation that we feel that should have not been missed, but were. For innovation dies when we only see the answers. The solutions kills innovation. So the camera film killed Kodak, the phone killed Nokia, and the DVD killed Blockbuster. What once was the answer to innovation killed the potential for it. And that's because innovation is transient. If we grab it for too long, it escapes from us. Over the course of the last decade, what we have seen is an increased adoption or fast rate of what that looked like. For example, the internet took 12 years for adoption. The phone took 6 years. And AI just recently went to 1 million users in just 5 days, in contrast to Facebook, which took them 10 months. The race is on. So how do we catch something that is constantly moving? It's a moving target. How can we like kind of grab it? The answer does not lie in answers, but in questions. And for that matter, the right questions. And the way I'm going to suggest that we're going to get there is through something I'm calling reality check moments. You see, I think we've all experienced that. Through the pandemic, when extreme measures forced our attention on healthcare, on our livelihoods at home and at work, suddenly all the questions that mattered became front, dead, and center. And everything which was less important went into the periphery. We kind of adopted and leveraged more of the technology that has been present for years into education with the remote learning. Healthcare became primary focus, and we started looking at how we can improve that, how we can introduce more telehealth, all of those solutions that have existed for so long, yet without that extreme kind of circumstance that took us there, we would have not seen them. And at the same time, we were not asking them. Yet, the pandemic allowed us to ask them. It kind of forced that even. And to me, that reflects the power of these reality check moments, which seems to happen when extreme measures or extreme circumstances kind of projects themselves on us. And to take it a little bit further, and I don't know if you know, in August 4 in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I was sitting in the apartment in DC working, and I came across a news which was sent to me that the major explosion has happened in the port in Lebanon, which I am originally from. And for an instance, I kind of froze. And the big reason of that is my family is there. And what do you think the only question that mattered in that instance was? The reality is the only question that mattered is my family okay? And thankfully they were okay. But that moment itself got me to think on how quickly we transition from so many distractions of the busy life, of the schedules and everything we have. And when we have these reality check moments, we automatically switch and transition to knowing exactly what the right questions are, which most often are extremely vulnerable, usually quite intimate, and have a certain level of uncertainty attached to them. And I believe innovation, for the most part, carries those qualities as well. So if you ask me, how do we get to the right questions? It's a little bit difficult because the first thing anyone will come up with is, what is the right question for everyone is different. And that's absolutely true. I cannot tell you what the right question is for you. But what I've realized after the fact during these circumstances is that the conditions kind of create if you want, the landscape for the right question to surface. These reality check moments create this ecosystem, if you'd like, for the questions to be available to us and ready. And that is what I would like to show you how we can get to. And I like to kind of use the model as if we're going onto the stage and everything that happens before is the rehearsal. And once we get onto the stage, we basically are performing. And in the performing, we're asking the right questions. But what we are preparing for is the stage. And what Reality Check and the Reality Check Stage Canvas, which I'll be introducing today, is really all about the preparation to get on the stage. So how do we get on the stage? For the most part, a lot of the frameworks that we are used to using, etc., are additive, where we're looking at either expanding on and analyzing everything that's happening within our periphery, going into the details and segmenting and all of that. But what I kind of realized and made the shift, and as I was trying to reverse engineer this reality check moment for the most part, is what we need is a little bit more of the opposite approach, which is really a removal. And the way we're going to do the removal is really by exposing. What we're going to do is we're going to expose a lot of the principles and factors that I think create this reality check moment. And by exposing them, we're going to allow them to come. And we're going to use a simple method, which is recognize, understand, and accept. And then we move on. So let's get into it. There is 3 main pillars that we will be kind of removing layer by layer, starting from the, I would say, easier to some extent, and then going into the more complex or the less usually visible, or that some of the models that we've used before have not necessarily familiarized us with. The first one is context, and I think context is familiar to so many. And with context, the first principle that we're going to talk about is leveraging scope. So reality check moments usually have an imposed scope. So the pandemic was imposed. It kind of projected on us a reality that we didn't necessarily have much to do with. But for most part, hopefully, we don't need to be in circumstances where we're in an imposed state, where we want to kind of leverage some of those constraints ahead of time that can shape our understanding of everything that's happening in our current reality. So the first thing we can leverage is scope, which is really just a set of rules and constraints that allow us to narrow our field of vision and understanding a problem or challenge. And that often, I think there is different ways to go about it as well. I think when we are scoping a context where we set some of those rules, a way to kind of go outside of it is to simulate it. And I think that's where a lot of the scenario building comes into play, where we simulate certain level of scenarios. And based on that simulation, it gives us a different lens or stepping in someone else's shoes to identify how we can operate or how we can think about that reality. And I can think that transition can start moving us from one. So, and that's what I call the simulated context, which is really just a simulation of what that is. So that's on the recognition part. When we go to the understanding, we jump into something I call tease the extremes. And in this case, one of the things that usually happen in an imposed context where we are overwhelmed with everything happening, it usually sits in a very high level of extreme which kind of, whether willingly or not, pulls our attention. So there is value in teasing the extremes as much as possible as we kind of grow our sphere of context and understanding. And I'll give a story here of Tyler Hayes, who was one of the people that I interviewed to kind of showcase a little bit that principle in practice. Tyler is the CEO of Atom Limbs, where they really are innovating on creating more functional limbs, which are more human-like. Fascinating what they're working on at the moment. And it's really interesting, his journey, because he's sold a couple of companies and now he's working on this one. But one of the key defining moments was when his dad passed away. And within that period, it gave him a kind of this aha moment or reality check moment of his own, where he went on and calculated how many hours and days he has left on Earth. And based on that, he kind of closed shop where he was in his hometown. Within 2 weeks, dropped his girlfriend, dropped everything, and went to San Francisco to kick off. And it's interesting what the kind of teasing the extreme and the thinking process that he did allowed him to realize how much little time he had to move into that next step. And I think it is a very strong way of kind of pulling us out of anything which we are in to recognize contexts that we are not in. So once we move to the last piece, which is be conscious of the current context. And I call the current context as such because what I found happens most often is once we are trying to assess what's happening or get a read on what's happening, we tend to go into why a lot. And part of what I'm saying, I'm trying to outline here in the current context, which is probably the last layer here when I accept and move on, is just outlining what is without the judgment of why it is as such. And in a lot of times, it's actually negative. We want to hit on those negative things which we are uncomfortable with. We want to hit on this does not work, here I failed. Things which in my experience and in a lot of contexts, people struggle to articulate because no one wants to fail. No one wants to see something not working. No one wants to as well recognize behavior which is necessarily not good behavior. We have a tendency to deflect from those things. And what we end up going into is more justifying them. We just jump into the justification rather than sitting a little bit with just what is. And I think if we can encapsulate some of that, then I can identify the current context, which will give us the best lens on the reality that we have. So with that, we cover context. The next layer, which I would like to kind of unpack and remove from at least our cognitive space is time. And I think time is a really important one. And I'm going to talk about it here as well in 3 layers. And the first of one is letting go. I think we are now in a society which is so built on who we are and what we are and how we define ourselves and identity, whether as an organization, to be honest, or as a person, irrespective. And that formulates a lot of our thinking. Like the past kind of locks us in how we identify. And what that creates actually creates a set of assumptions that we are kind of rooted in that we are afraid to challenge. And that's, I think, is one of the key things we want to let go. It's harder said than done because usually it requires a lot of vulnerability in identifying that. And even it happens for organizations where the values that they project are the basis of their identity are not necessarily reflective in the behavior. And it's very hard to see that if we don't let go of them in the first place to actually see that there is a disconnect. The assumption will always overwhelm in a certain way, kind of our thinking and our bias to a certain part. So from letting go, we move into embracing ambiguity. And I think embracing ambiguity, I'll tell here a story which I think it's really interesting how hard that is. At the same time, we talk about it a lot, but it's much harder in practice. And in the practice, what does it really mean? So a couple of years back, I started taking singing classes. And mind you, I have zero background in like singing or anything. I'm actually even tone deaf to some extent, so I can only repeat what I listen to. But one of the interesting, and it was opera, so it was classical music. I was going and trying to, enunciate and do everything. And in learning that, what you realize that there's a lot of control. Usually, what you're being asked of is to control a lot of things, control how you breathe, control how you support, do all of those things. But at the same time, you need to let go completely and embrace a certain level of ambiguity what's happening. The reason is that the instrument is inside you. Like the instrument is not something you can visualize. It's like really completely outside of the scope of what you can see. So you have to have certain level of leap of faith that everything you set up will do. And that creates a level of frustration, or if you want, a level of discomfort. And I do believe, embracing ambiguity, we can never live outside of that discomfort. That discomfort always exists. And the more we are aware that the discomfort exists and use it as a measure to tease how much we are like embracing ambiguity, I think helps us as well in kind of removing some of, I put it in the context of time because a lot of, I think in time, we are looking at control, like with our identity, we're looking at control. When I say I am what, it gives us a certain like an answer, a clear answer. And ambiguity sits on the complete opposites of side of that, where we are like less, we're letting go of something to accept something which we don't know for sure where it's going to go. And it's really just letting go to some extent. And the last piece of time is the future. And this one, I said, identify moments of truth. And one of the key, like this principle is really interesting because it really sits in hopes, which I think everyone thinks are a good thing, or in general are aspirations, our expectations in the future that we like to see hide so much from us. And a very good kind of example of that is one of the interviewees, which I kind of highlighted in this section, which was Ula Helen. And Ula was watching football with his dad, and suddenly he saw that he no longer knew the rules. And upon seeing that, it dawned on him that his dad was starting to lose or forget things. And unfortunately, he had Alzheimer's. And, they were still catching on it at that moment. But what is really interesting about that is how he dealt with that change in his father's health versus his mom. And not to say that it was a good thing, but what he said is because he accepted it and realized it and did not sit with the hopes of like getting better or the hopes and expectations of something else as an outcome, he was able to capture so much of these precious moments and capitalize on them, opening himself to a scope of opportunity which was not never present. And he ended up saying, while it was not a good experience, it wasn't a bad experience either. While for his mom, it was really a bad experience. And that outlines really the power of these moments of truth. Once we let go, once we embrace ambiguity and accept them, like how opportunity starts kind of opening for us, or like we can see things outside the scope which we're not. And I'm going to jump into the last one, which I think is the most difficult. And the last one is the observer. And I call it observer because it's really us. And I call it observer because it creates a certain distance between us as, the observer, and give us a way that we can actually look into ourselves. And I think it's a really interesting lens to kind of project when we are unpacking this last layer. And this last layer starts with speaking the same language as a principle. And the reason I say that is because language is the gateway and the gateway keeper. We often really miss how much language constrains what's coming out, or what it represents and what we are saying. And I see that as well across domains a lot. So between design and between technology and business, there is so much syntax which create assumptions, which is baked into the language, which we miss. And without necessarily unpacking it, it really adds so much layers, of kind of it like masks of so much of what's happening. So the first principle to recognize here on the observer specifically is speak the same language, because it's the most outward thing that we as humans kind of possess. And second is leveraging anchors. So this one we move a little bit more internal. We all have specific things that we kind of rely on when we are making our decision making or bias or stereotypes. And there is so much of them that when we don't recognize them, whether they are good or bad, which is really the interesting part here, they kind of have more control of us than not. So for example, for me, my family is very important. So automatically, a lot of the decisions that I do always are impacted by that. And that implicates as well how innovation, because anchors are already limiting the scope of what you can do or what you cannot do. So if what you're innovating against goes against some of these anchors, you will never see it because it's something you cannot accept. And like really digging and identifying them kind of breaks outside of that pattern. And here we come to the last one. And usually it's the most difficult thing. Do not think, listen. So, and this one, so this is really key, because I think for every educated and intellectual person, thinking sits at the core of who we are. But what I've realized is really in those moments which we have absolute clarity, we're actually not really thinking. And I'll give you an example in multiple things that we do. We've all kind of fall in love, or we've all skied down the mountain, or we're all like we're taken in by something so completely that in those moments, like the thinking kind of disappeared. And I say that because to truly be able to get to a point where we can see what the right questions are, we need to listen. And the last layer to remove is the thinking. So what that usually translates to effectively in a meeting or something else is like not judging what to say next, not trying to solve the problem early, not trying to criticize or all of that. And that requires an extreme level of trust in ourselves and vulnerability to be able to project or actually to behave in that way. Otherwise, we are stuck. We're stuck in our own thoughts. And I think that's the most dangerous layer that we end up in for the most part. So in short, reality check moments happen when we kind of remove as much as the context parameters by recognizing the current context, when we identify the moments of truth, eventually, and those all on the exception layer. And then as observers, we do not think, but listen. We remove all the layers that can create a certain level of bias and just be present for that moment. And that, that does not creates kind of and that's why I said it creates a stage for it. Does not necessarily gives you the, right questions right away. And what most often people think that, they want it instantaneously. It cannot be instantaneous. Like, right, it takes a certain level of work and effort to go through all of those pieces and get there. So I want to take a bit of time now. If you end up sharing a challenge, that we can go through it together through this model and try to unpack it. If we have any volunteers.
Sorry. Carlo, I believe that Barbara has offered in the chat a challenge that she encountered in the past when she worked for a large consumer products good company, packaged good company.
Awesome.
They had a product where the actual reality was that they changed the packaging. It was hard to open, but the company thought that the reason they stopped buying is they didn't like the taste of the product. So there was a lot of lack of clarity there. So perhaps you want to take that sort of challenge and filter it through your Canvas framework here.
Sure. So the challenge was that there was a product which was no longer desirable to a consumer. Is that correct?
Right. or I guess, or Barbara, you feel free to jump in if you want, but sales of the product, I think, were dropping off.
Yeah.
Yes. It
Okay.
impacted sales.
So Barbara, can I ask you some questions? So to go through
Sure,
this?
sure.
Excellent. So probably one of the first thing is, what was the market target audience and the market that it was, operating in?
Primarily US, but a national branded product. So yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in that context, the sales dropped extremely. There was a significant sudden drop.
They had some new flavor variants, and so I think one of the key factors, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but they had updated the packaging and they had introduced some new flavors, and then the sales weren't to their expectations based on other items in the line. So the assumption was that people didn't like the taste of the new flavors. But we also found in digging deeper that they would change new packaging at the same time, and it was much more difficult to open that packaging. So I think the two-factor element, you got both teams saying the other team had made a change that was impacting things. But it was really falling to, most of the early meetings were about the flavor, and all the testing and all the sampling we didn't indicate there was an issue with the flavors. So
yeah. So in this case, you already know the solution. So you already had an answer, right?
yeah.
So
sorry for my example.
No, not at all. It's a bit tricky because once there is an answer, it kind of we always kind of anchor towards it, irrespective of where we are going. So it makes it more challenging. But I can at least abstract out in that context some of the things that could play around and how some of these principles could be leveraged, right? And I think here, new variables were introduced to a set of constraints. One of the variables basically, was considered to be the culprit earlier on, like, right? And as well, you had the dynamics of two teams. So here I see a lot of this, like, this is your fault, my fault, and we're letting go of some of these assumptions, like really play a big role. And this is as well a bit on the current context where people cannot see the realities of what they are because they are justifying. And so there is already there a justification. We changed the label, we changed that. That's why that automatically masks a significant portion of the real problem, right? And I would say that actually in big organization, that's usually one of the biggest challenges because you have different groups which are operating in different realms. And ideally, when they go against each other, the defensive modes jumps up. So in those usually setups, what I try to do is remove some of the defensive layers to actually get to really what's happening and not necessarily the justification of what's happening. And that's why I say it's really focused on what is. And then if we move on the time and let go, I try to remove a little bit of the, kind of identification of the team with the solution that they came up with, because that's kind of will mask a lot of, what really is happening. So, and that could be done in different ways, like, giving the bigger umbrella of the company and including them, like, broadening the scope, right? Allowing some of the discomfort to seep in. And when discomfort seeps in, usually requires a lot of trust. And usually what is lacking in that conversation is the trust. And some of the ways I can see, helping in that is sharing other moments of truth where those things have happened to feel, to a little bit kind of remove how big of this issue is. Like, right, I always feel when we expose others to some of those struggles, it makes it easier for them to share as well some of those elements. And definitely here, I would say one of the things is speaking the same language is always an issue, and especially if depending on the product teams. It's hard really here to, visualize that, especially if one is on packaging, which is usually concerned about a certain set of design and things like that, and like less on the chemistry, but the looks, right? And then you have one which is more concerned on the flavor and the chemistry of it and the components. And how do you share that what you're trying to achieve is the same through so what ends up happening is here connecting the dots from the shared goal to specifically those is not there. And that's usually, it's a languaging kind of problem, less so than a real problem most of the time. And how does the packaging changes get us there? And what does that look like? And how does the flavor change get us there? And where is the gap? Where did we break in that? So the model is very high level because it tries to accommodate for a lot of these complexities. But usually when we go to the practical, it goes down to that, like, right? With language, we're modeling from one step to the other, how we move from this point to this point, and then find a unifying point. And the questions there will highlight really, we'll start open at least, and I would say the scope of the problem domain a little bit wider and allow people to be more vulnerable and accepting it.
Yeah.
Any
Your
go ahead.
example of speak the same language really speaks to what happened, because in our R&D department for packaging, and this is just what happened, but and I'm not picking on anybody, but it was men who were developing the packaging and testing.
Okay.
Oh, this is easy to open, et cetera, et cetera. And then the end users were primarily women, and the package was for a woman's upper body strength. It was harder for the women to open than the men. So the men were like, this is no problem. I opened it fine. And the women were like, I went in and I was like, I can't open this, And so then we got into the like, wow, how much pressure does it really take to open this thing? And then that got into the conversation. So you speak the same language. It wasn't verbal language, but it was another type of language, that got to the point.
And I think here, what you just said is really interesting, like, right, on the stereotype that I can do it versus you cannot do it, like, right. That's why what ends up happening when we're listening to those things is usually you have some form of defensive and justifying, like, but I could do it, like, right, why they are not can do it, without recognizing that there is a different set of parameters on the other hand, like, right, completely. And like tuning into some of those things is usually hard if the same people who are doing the analysis or like breaking through it are the ones who are doing it, because automatically they dismissed that part, like, right. And
it never occurred to anyone. Yes.
it never occurred to them. And that's why I feel kind of, you have the context, you have the time, but you have the observer, you have the people who are actually engaged, what they're coming in. As a man, I'm strong. I'm like, right, I cannot, it's easy for me. Like, you come in with already these statements in your head. And I consider those are anchors. And those are the anchors which we don't want to accept. Like, these are anchors which we struggle to accept and highlight very, very often. But like, I'm stronger. What does that mean? Like, right. And kind of that leads down the way where we completely dismiss it. Like, we don't even, it's not even in our periphery.
Interesting. Yeah. It's a great model. It's really fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for participating and being open to share.
Thank you.
Okay. Before we open to questions, I'll just go into what's next. If you find this interesting, what can you do? So the first thing is actually you can download this one. It's available on the website, which I'm going to share a link to. You can work through it, which I hope you would. What I've realized in a lot of the conversation, to get to the right questions that really are there, it takes around an hour, especially if you're unpacking a lot of those layers. Before that, half an hour, I interview so many people and I've done so many different scenarios. And I honestly feel like at the threshold, usually, of course, on one-on-one, it's one thing. In a team setting, it's different. And a team setting is more complex. So you need to add time. But in a one-on-one setting, at least takes an hour. So please work through it. Of course, there's the book, which actually gives a little bit more examples and details. Each chapter is basically based on one of those principles. So the link to both is here. You can scan the QR code or go to realitycheck.institute/Canvas. On the realitycheck.institute website, I usually post all of those things. So this is, you want to take it on your own. I'm before I wrap up, I think it's interesting to highlight some of the challenges usually I find. And some of them we addressed with your demo here, Barbara, as well. So I'm going to bring those up to the front. One of the first things is, if the ship is big, when you're steering a big ship, the tendencies to miss a lot of things on the current context is super high. And the example I give here, we were doing a major digital transformation in like a 2,000 people kind of organization. And what ends up happening often is that the shifts that we are introducing or the changes are so small that our expectations are so far away that we realize they don't dare. And that's something usually very easily missed when like kind of trying to outline the context. Because the context is trying to give you a snapshot of where you are to see if you've moved, you've not moved, like what are the current circumstances and underlying. And when you don't see them, a lot of the times you feel that you're stagnating, you haven't been able to move, like you see problems, you don't see those. And usually size matters, the scales matters, and our expectations, how far they are from the reality matters too, which requires in most cases some calibration. Another aspect, which I think here kind of as well, we tacked on when we talk about time and identity, and it's possession, like, right? No one wants to kill their baby. No one wants to identify that, something that they hold so dear is. So that's why you end up with, when you're trying to let go, I think it's very hard to do the letting go or even embracing ambiguity when you have a very close relationship to something. And I see that often and often with different types of product. The product sits like near and so close to their hearts. They've been working on it on 10 years. Sometimes just recognizing these facts is so important. Like, you've worked on this for so long. There is no way you're not attached to it in some way or form, whether it's a product or a market or a sales, whatever the kind of the highlight is. And the last thing tied to the observer is when I talk about do not think, and it's not about meditation. It's not like about going into a Zen mode and like kind of flat out kind of disregarding anything. I think it's really more engagement. I like to give the skiing thing, like you are super engaged, even though it feels that you are on auto mode, like you're flowing with the things, but you're actually very engaged. You're not passive in any way or forming. And that when you're not thinking, that does not mean listening is not an engagement, an active engagement for that matter. And that's, highlighting that to see, to kind of delineate how much of a challenge that is. So with that, I would wrap up. I would say this is the link. If you find some of these challenges or anything else, and looking to fast track, I'm always happy to give talks and facilitate some of that. Thank you so much, Anthony. This has been great. And I think we can open it now to some questions. This is the link to where you can find the canvas, and the QR code as well will take you there. And you will find the book and everything else.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carlo. Yes, this is excellent. I do encourage everyone to check out the book and the website. It's a very nice website and these resources on it, and take a look at the canvas and so forth. So that was very, very enlightening and useful. And I just want to reiterate, I think it's so important as innovators that we work very hard inside of our organizations with our teams to really get down to the truth of situations, or the reality of situations, because anytime we try to pursue innovations outside of that reality, we generally tend to fail, right? Or the innovation fails, right? And the only way the innovations that will work, or the only way they will work, is that if they're rooted in reality and having those reality moments. In fact, I was kind of struck by this. I read the book a couple of years ago when it came out, called Working Backwards, Inside Stories and Secrets from Inside Amazon. And the one thing that struck me in that story about Amazon was that the one thing they really work really hard to do is to get to reality. They work very hard to test their assumptions, peel back the layers, and really test everything and get to reality. But it takes doing a lot of the practices you talked about here, in terms of really being present and anchoring in things and having common language and embracing the ambiguity to test those things and use the questions. So this very much resonates with me. I appreciate that. And we do want to open it up to everyone's questions and comments here. If you have a specific burning question for Carlo that you would like him to address, feel free to either put it in the chat window or to jump on with your microphone and ask the question. So, Carlo, I don't know if you have the chat window open or not, but we have here some comments and questions, and in particular from Ole in Denmark. He wants to know, do you have some pointers on how to facilitate this? I assume you have encountered some resistors to your approach. Might have been some very efficient people who just wanted to get to the problem to be solved and didn't want to go through this process. So tell us what your pointers are in facilitating this.
Absolutely. A great question. Thank you. I think, first off, I like really exposing so many things ahead of time on what the engagement looks like, right? And removing some of the tensions into it. So usually one of the first thing which I said is, if they're rushing into it, like make sure that there is time kind of to get into it. Because what ends up happening is everyone wants the answer. We have a significant need to want the answers. And that actually prohibits us from actually asking the right questions. Like this kind of like will like really kind of set us back. And just flagging that is actually really important. So every time people start coming up with answers, it's actually not like it's actually creating a little bit of the problems. The second thing I will bring up is, you know, I would introduce that everyone should leave a little bit uncomfortable. And I say that because people like to control. Like we come in with an agenda and we want everything to be controlled, everything to be like right. And a lot of these principles are really hinging on an authentic kind of vulnerable experience. And I don't believe in any context that could happen if someone did not leave a little bit uncomfortable. So setting that up in the beginning, that there is going to be a little bit of that discomfort, or even exposing it in some game, is really crucial, because a big part of that is really being very authentic. And that's really where the do not thinking listen kind of happens, is in that authenticity where we stand in our own truth, is really where that happens. And like people feeling that they accomplished something and they're a little bit uncomfortable, setting that ahead of time will really ease in people going in and like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting, because everyone goes into meeting or like workshops coming up with like, okay, we finalized this and this is exactly what we're gonna do and this is the strategy go forward or whatever, right? And putting that, some of those things. I usually, those two things, setting those mindsets earlier on for me are really key. If these are not present or available, I would say this is not going to work. Like, right. And I think it's okay to say that this is not going to work. I think setting that as well up as an expectation will remove some of those resistance from people who are like, okay, if you don't have the time and the bandwidth and you feel uncomfortable, like really you feel uncomfortable in being authentic, and that's not something, I work with a lot of different cultures, and I think different cultures have tendencies for that differently. I worked across the Nordics, and I worked across India, and I worked abroad the Middle East. So it as well has certain cultural tendencies you have to watch out for. Ola, thank you so much. I think I went on a little bit further on the question, that question. Hope it's helpful.
I think that's very helpful, and it's a valid point too. And your point is valid. Like you have to be able to create an environment where people are able to be authentic, which means they're also able to be vulnerable and admit like, I don't know something, right?
Yeah.
Which is also to say that when you enter into this process, we kind of have to set our egos aside, right? Egos
For sure.
can really be a blocker in this process. And if we come in and we've got an ego and we think we have the answer and we're not willing to be authentic and vulnerable and open and ask questions, then this process isn't going to work. You have to get those egos out of the way as well. You probably have encountered that a little bit too, Carlo.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, every time I talk about the observer, I'm talking a lot about the ego. Like if I want a position too, there's the authentic self and there's the ego self, and the ego self is worried about things. It's like, worried, how I'm going to do this? How, like, et cetera, et cetera. That's your weakest position to be in. Like understanding that's your weakest position to be in. And it's hard. I think we have so much expectation from society, from our organization, that set us apart from that. And it's hard. And it's okay to acknowledge that it's hard. As well, I think we should... like it's not that simple, right? Because you're measured on your performance, you're measured on like certain things, so those all kind of come into play, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, I think that's an important cultural thing inside of organizations, and even going way back to when Peter Senge wrote The Fifth Discipline and the Learning Organization, he talked about this, where we kind of have to put that ego self on the shelf, and put that aside and just be objective and authentic and honest. But that does require a culture that allows you to do that, that nurtures that.
For sure.
And if there's a lot of cultural fear and animosity and problems going inside an organization, people have a hard time bringing themselves to being that authentic self, that observer. There's so much to be said. It's a whole nother lesson, right? About the culture inside organizations that are accommodating this environment that lets people be authentic and be that observer and put aside the ego and do this process. So it certainly is nurtured in the right culture. That's important. So Sarah has a question too here for us in the chat. She says, is it important to set the scene for participants to future pace the potential discomfort that might surface, or otherwise let them know ahead of time, and then to show them that the biggest breakdowns often lead to the biggest breakthrough? So setting the scene in the context and letting them know, what the process is going to feel like. Can you speak to that, Carlo?
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe it's important to set because so if you are already in a team that has that level of trust between each other, it's less important. Definitely, like right, you just can go right into it, and that's fine. Like right, and usually that should allow you to, the way you see this and visibly through the behavior is like where disagreements happen. Because if you go into this and all of historically, so if you're looking back, if all of the things you go in and everyone is like, yeah, I'm aligned and I'm aligned and I'm aligned, good luck. That trust doesn't exist, like, because there is no way you're aligned. and if you are, there is much more bigger problems, I think, in that context. So I would say get a pulse on what that looks like. If your previous engagement usually end up in disagreements and like there is a bit of disruption in the conversation, that's a good thing. Like should be some sort of level of disruption. If everyone is homogenizing very quickly, that means you need to set the stage. You need to basically preempt them that that's going to happen. And that usually, it's not going to block it all the way, but at least it kind of helps a little bit. So you can flag it during the conversation, you can flag it. It's like, we're homogenizing here. Like we're kind of pushing. Let's try not to do that. Like, right. And then you have something that you can kind of come back to. And I think that is extremely helpful.
Yeah. I mean, because, you don't want to move too quickly into this deductive logic where you're just coming to answers. You want to spend a lot of this time working through inductive logic and coming up with these questions. So I was just wondering then, in that sense, if this is happening too soon, if you're moving toward convergence and homogeneity, do you actually ask people, Carlo, the question like, how would you disagree with this? Or what do you see wrong about this argument? Would you try to really tease that out of them?
I struggle with that one because the defense modes come up like this. Like people are really like kind of waiting for you to kind of tease them. And I don't know. So I think sometimes it works. Sometimes you can tease it out. Yeah. Sometimes I try to describe the situation so they can get what's happening. So I would try to paint a picture, like, right, and say, if these elements are happening, and I think people sometimes struggle to see these things. So, and if I give you an example, engineering, for example, a lot of the times you have a product, you have a roadmap, like, right? I simply highlight, okay, it took the team this much time from here to here to do this, and then this much time from here to here to do this. And this is the amount of things that we are able to do in that capacity. And then now you're telling me we're adding like the 16, 17 items of scope, and you're saying you have time. How does that work? Like, right? So sometimes just laying out what's happening is actually very, very good in basically pushing people to disagree. You're giving them things to anchor on the disagreement. And I usually try to create multiple of those. Same in describing behavior. I say, like, what I see in this behavior is this happening. You are acting like this, and this responding is because of this. And then instead of trying to defend on the question, they're trying to articulate and make me understand why that's happening. And automatically they will have to disagree or agree, without necessarily realizing it.
Very, very good. Yeah, and another technique that some organizations use is just to bring in outsiders to join the conversation.
Absolutely, and right. That's if you're bringing an outsider, the outsider lens always helps, of course.
It does, and you can ask them to sort of play devil's advocate and challenge the assumptions being made. Sure. This is where too, like sometimes organizations, they have all engineers, they'll bring in a philosopher or a poet, someone who has a very different cognitive framework in developing that cognitive diversity in the team, because they do tend to disagree and see things differently and play devil's advocate. So I think that can really be help kickstart the that really intuitive thinking process inside the group.
For sure. I like to call it sometimes playing the idiot a little bit, because it gives people like some power. Like, I'm super new to this. I have no clue what you're doing. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
enlighten me to some extent, right?
The beginner's mindset.
Same principle. It just sets the mindset a little bit. Again, it's really a power play in a lot of times, and defensiveness. We're trying to break some of these. We're trying to get to the vulnerability, like, as quickly as possible, and that helps.
Yeah, it does. It does. And being at a social party sometimes helps to loosen people up.
Sure, for
just
sure.
creating a different
Usually
environment.
at social party you have the drinking, so that helps significantly too.
I was gonna say that, but I'll let you say it. Yes, a few beers will loosen people up, right? So
yeah, for sure.
The inhibitions tend to lower, and if you can get those inhibitions lower, you can often get to a richer conversation. But whatever it takes to get the inhibitions lower, and like you mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in other cultures too, where there's more power distance between people, and so the inhibitions tend to be higher. So a lot of times you have to actually work on the preliminary to get people past these inhibitions and the cultural barriers and the power distances, just to get them where they're comfortable, and then bring in some of those outside perspectives. And this can lead to very fruitful and productive conversations about the situation,
For sure.
and very, very good reality moments. So I think with that, that's starting to bring us toward the top of the hour. If anyone has a last burning question, pop it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap things up. And I just want to say thank you so much to Carlo, and I appreciate your insights and your perspective and your experience, and the work you've done in writing this book. And it's very insightful and valuable. So thank you for being our guest today, Carlo. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It was a pleasure, really. And thank you all for the engagement.
Yes, thank you. And so thank you also to all of our attendees who joined us. I see people from the United States, from Nigeria, from Botswana, from Denmark, from different parts of the Middle East. It's a very beautiful, wonderful global audience we have here, and thank you all for joining us as our attendees. So we'll make that a wrap, and to say thank you and have a great day to everyone, and enjoy your innovating. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next month.